Caleb Turner had delivered mail along the same route for nearly 8 years. Most people assumed that made his job boring. The truth was exactly the opposite. When you spent years walking the same streets, climbing the same apartment stairwells, and stopping at the same houses every day, you learned things. You noticed changes others missed. You noticed when an elderly man who always watered his roses suddenly stopped. You noticed when a family that usually received birthday cards every month no longer got any. You noticed when a teenager who once smiled and waved began avoiding eye contact. The neighborhood became a living puzzle, and Caleb had unknowingly become one of its most careful observers. His route stretched through a busy section of the city where aging brick apartment buildings stood beside renovated townhomes. Small businesses lined the main avenue. A laundromat sat next to a barber shop. A diner shared a wall with a pharmacy. People came and went constantly. Yet one group seemed permanent: the seniors. They occupied porch swings, park benches, library reading rooms, and folding chairs outside apartment entrances. They seemed to know everyone and everything. Caleb often joked that if the city government ever collapsed, the neighborhood's retirees could probably run things better. One Tuesday morning in October, something unusual caught his attention. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't suspicious. It was simply odd. As he sorted envelopes before beginning his route, he noticed a tiny, handwritten triangle near the stamp on one letter addressed to Ruth Delgado. The mark was small enough that most people would never notice it. Caleb assumed it was accidental. Perhaps someone testing a pin. He delivered the letter and forgot about it. 3 days later, another envelope caught his eye. This one was addressed to Walter Kim. Near the return address sat a small circle with a line through it. Different symbol, different sender, different handwriting. Caleb frowned. That was strange, but not strange enough to dwell on. Then he saw another, and another. Within 2 weeks, he had counted 11 envelopes carrying unusual markings: tiny symbols, triangles, circles, crosses, dots, short lines, all handwritten. All addressed to elderly residents living within a few blocks of one another. The symbols never appeared on business mail, never on advertisements, never on utility bills, only personal letters. At first, Caleb tried ignoring it. People sent weird mail all the time. But curiosity has a way of growing, especially when patterns emerge. By November, he began quietly recording the markings in a small notebook. Date, address, symbol, nothing more. He wasn't snooping into anyone's private correspondence. He simply noted what was visible on the outside of envelopes. After several weeks, his notebook contained dozens of entries. And something became obvious. The symbols weren't random. They repeated. Certain combinations appeared together. Some residents received letters with similar markings multiple times each month. Others only received specific symbols. It looked organized, intentional, like a language. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Caleb found himself standing beneath the awning of the neighborhood library during a downpour. Inside, he spotted Denise Harper shelving books. Denise had worked at the library for over 20 years. She loved puzzles, local history, and mysteries, which made her exactly the wrong person to tell about the symbols if Caleb wanted to stop thinking about them. He stepped inside. Denise glanced up. "You're drenched." "Occupational hazard." She smiled. "What brings you here?" Caleb hesitated, then pulled out his notebook. "Tell me something." Her eyes immediately brightened. "That usually means trouble." He opened the notebook and showed her pages of carefully drawn symbols. She studied them. Her smile disappeared. "Interesting. You think so?" "I know so." Caleb sat across from her at a reading table. "For months, I've been seeing these on envelopes." Denise turned pages slowly. "You sure they're connected?" "I wasn't. Now I am." She nodded thoughtfully. "Looks like a code." "That's what I thought." "You tell anyone else?" "No." "Good." "Why good?" Denise leaned back. "Because if it is a code, the people using it probably intended it to stay private." That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it pulled Caleb deeper. For the next hour, they examined every symbol. Frequency, placement, patterns, possible meanings. Nothing made sense. Yet neither of them believed the markings were accidental. The following week, Denise called him. Her voice sounded excited. "I found something." Caleb met her at the library after work. She spread papers across a table. Old communication systems. "What?" "Codes." He blinked. "You research secret codes?" "You handed me a mystery." She pointed to examples. Railroad workers, neighborhood watches, community organizations. Even immigrant communities decades earlier had occasionally used harmless coded markings to communicate information discreetly. "Think that's what this is?" Caleb asked. "Maybe." "Maybe what?" Denise tapped one of his sketches. "The symbols aren't complicated enough to carry detailed messages individually." "So?" "So each symbol may represent a category." Caleb stared. "Meaning?" "Meaning the real message isn't the symbol. The symbol tells someone where to look for the message." The idea lingered in Caleb's mind for days. Then another strange event occurred. A teenage boy named Darius Reed approached him during his route. Caleb knew him only casually. 16 years old, smart kid, quiet, usually respectful. That day he looked nervous. "Mr. Turner." "Hey, Darius." The boy glanced around. "You ever feel like people are watching everything?" Caleb laughed lightly. "Depends who's watching." Darius didn't smile. His expression remained tense. "Never mind." He started walking away, then stopped. "Some people around here act like they know stuff before it happens." "What kind of stuff?" Darius shrugged. "Nothing." But Caleb could see fear behind the teenager's eyes. The conversation stayed with him, especially because Darius had recently started spending time with older teenagers known for causing trouble. Caleb had noticed. The seniors had probably noticed too. Everybody noticed. A few days later, Caleb encountered Ruth Delgado. She sat on her porch, as she often did, reading a newspaper. At 76, Ruth possessed the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades teaching children and refusing to tolerate nonsense. She smiled when Caleb approached. "Morning." "Morning." She accepted her mail, then paused. "You seem distracted lately." Caleb laughed. "Am I that obvious?" "Very." He considered mentioning the symbols. Instead, he said, "Just thinking." Ruth studied him carefully. "Teachers never stopped being teachers." "You know," she said, "people underestimate observation." "What do you mean?" "They think helping others requires power." Caleb listened. "Sometimes helping simply means paying attention." The statement seemed innocent, yet something about the way she said it made him uneasy, like it carried hidden meaning. That evening, Caleb reviewed his notebook again. The symbols, the letters, the seniors, the strange comments. The growing feeling that something important sat just beneath the surface. He couldn't prove it, couldn't explain it, but he felt it. A week later, the mystery took a major turn. Jordan Brooks entered the story. Caleb first met Jordan when Denise invited both of them to the library after hours. The teenager arrived carrying a laptop and enough confidence for 3 people. "You're the mail guy." "Mail carrier," Jordan grinned. "Fair." Denise explained everything. The symbols, the notebook, the patterns. Jordan listened carefully, then began entering data into a spreadsheet. Hours passed. The library eventually closed. Still, they worked. Near midnight, Jordan suddenly sat upright. "Oh!" Denise looked up. "What?" "I found something." Caleb moved closer. Jordan pointed at the screen. The symbols weren't random. They followed timing patterns. Certain markings consistently appeared before specific others, like signals, updates, status changes. The structure resembled communication networks. Not letters, not words, notifications. The discovery electrified the room. Jordan kept working. Eventually, another pattern emerged. Addresses. Every recipient lived within walking distance of one another. Almost like nodes in a network, people passing information. The realization sent chills through Caleb. What exactly are these people communicating? Nobody had an answer. For the next month, they searched for one. Winter arrived. Temperatures dropped. Holiday decorations appeared. Yet the coded letters continued. Then, shortly before Christmas, Caleb witnessed something unexpected. He was delivering mail near an abandoned apartment complex scheduled for demolition. The building had become a magnet for trouble. Police visited frequently. Residents avoided it. As Caleb approached, he noticed movement near the entrance. 3 older teenagers stood talking with a younger boy. The younger boy looked uncomfortable, nervous, trapped. One of the older boys handed him something. Money, maybe. Caleb couldn't tell. Then a voice called out, "Afternoon, gentlemen." Everyone turned. Walter Kim approached from across the street carrying grocery bags. The older teenagers immediately looked irritated. Walter smiled pleasantly. "Beautiful day." Nobody responded. The retired mechanic continued walking, slowly, calmly, directly past them. Nothing threatening, nothing dramatic. Yet the older teenagers dispersed within moments. The younger boy hurried away. Walter continued walking as though nothing had happened. Caleb watched from a distance, confused. Later that evening, he wrote down everything he had seen. The next morning, another coded envelope appeared in Walter's mail. Coincidence? Maybe. But Caleb was beginning to believe in fewer coincidences. January arrived. Snow dusted rooftops. The mystery deepened. Then, one afternoon, Denise called with urgency in her voice. "You need to come to the library." "What happened?" "Just get here." Caleb arrived 20 minutes later. Jordan was already there. Both looked stunned. Denise handed him a newspaper clipping. The article described a foster child who had disappeared from another city several years earlier. At first, Caleb didn't understand. Then Denise pointed to handwritten notes beside the article. Names, dates, addresses, connections. Jordan had cross-referenced public records with addresses from the coded network. Several elderly residents appeared connected to community volunteer programs involving at-risk youth. Others had backgrounds in education, social work, nursing, counseling, or public service. The network wasn't random, not even close. Every participant seemed connected to children. Caleb slowly lowered the paper. A realization formed. What if they're tracking kids? Silence filled the room. Nobody dismissed the idea, because suddenly everything fit. The observations, the timing, the secrecy. The elderly residents weren't exchanging gossip. They were monitoring something. Or someone. Jordan swallowed hard. I checked school reports, community notices, public records. And? The teenager looked troubled. A lot of vulnerable kids keep showing up around the same addresses connected to this network. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What kind of vulnerable kids? Jordan hesitated. Kids nobody seems to be paying attention to. The room fell silent. Outside, snow drifted gently past library windows. Inside, 3 people stared at a growing collection of evidence. The mystery was finally beginning to reveal its true shape, and none of them were prepared for how big it would become. Because the coded letters weren't hiding a crime, they were hiding a mission that had been operating quietly for years. And somewhere in the middle of it all, children were depending on people nobody would ever suspect. The discovery changed everything. Until that moment, Caleb had treated the coded envelopes like an intriguing neighborhood mystery. Now, the mystery had faces. Children's faces. And that made it impossible to ignore. For the next several weeks, Caleb, Denise, and Jordan continued gathering information carefully. They weren't trying to invade anyone's privacy. They simply followed publicly available records, community reports, and observations from everyday life. The deeper they looked, the more remarkable the pattern became. Children who appeared disconnected from stable families often seemed to have invisible safety nets surrounding them. A teenager struggling in school suddenly received tutoring. A child whose guardian had been hospitalized somehow always had meals available. A boy living in a dangerous apartment complex found a mentor. A girl who frequently skipped classes was quietly encouraged back into school. Nobody received public recognition. Nobody took credit. The help simply appeared, again and again, as though an unseen group was watching. One evening, Caleb sat in the diner near the post office, reviewing notes, when Linda Brooks slid into the booth across from him. Jordan's mother looked exhausted after a long hospital shift. I hear you've been chasing ghosts. Caleb smiled. Jordan talks too much. He gets that from me. She stirred her coffee. Then her expression grew serious. Denise told me what you found. Caleb nodded. What do you think? Linda stared through the diner window for a moment. In emergency rooms, you learn something. What? The kids who suffer most aren't always the ones who make headlines. Caleb listened. The hardest cases are the children nobody notices. Her voice softened. They miss appointments, move constantly, change schools repeatedly, fall through cracks. She looked back at him. If someone in this neighborhood has found a way to protect those kids, I wouldn't be surprised. The conversation stayed with Caleb, because the more he observed the neighborhood, the more evidence he saw. Not evidence of wrongdoing, evidence of care. Tiny acts, invisible acts, the kind most people overlooked. One afternoon, he noticed Ruth Delgado walking home with 2 grocery bags. A teenage girl carried the heavier bag. Ruth wasn't helping the girl was helping Ruth. Yet as they talked, Caleb could see the teenager smiling, relaxed, comfortable, like she trusted the older woman completely. The next day, Walter Kim spent nearly an hour teaching a young boy how to repair a bicycle chain. The day after that, another elderly resident attended a high school basketball game despite having no grandchildren on the team. Small moments, individually meaningless, together they painted a picture. The seniors weren't merely watching the neighborhood, they were investing in it. Then something happened that confirmed Caleb's suspicions. It began with Darius Reed. The teenager had become increasingly withdrawn during the winter. Caleb occasionally spotted him with a group of older youths who lingered near abandoned properties and convenience stores. Everyone knew trouble followed them. Nobody seemed able to stop it. One Friday evening, Caleb was walking toward his car after work when he noticed Darius sitting alone at a bus stop. The boy stared at the pavement, shoulders slumped, defeated. Caleb almost kept walking. Then he changed direction. Mind if I sit? Darius shrugged. Caleb sat beside him. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Darius sighed. You ever make a mistake and know you're going to regret it? Most people call that adulthood. The teenager laughed weakly. Then the smile vanished. They keep offering me things. Who? Darius didn't answer. He didn't need to. Caleb already knew. Money? A slight nod. Stuff? Another nod. What do they want? Darius looked away. Favors. The answer chilled Caleb. Not because it was surprising, because it wasn't. Thousands of vulnerable teenagers heard similar offers every year. Easy money, quick respect, belonging. Things that sounded attractive when life had given you very little. Before Caleb could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. Evening, gentlemen. Ruth Delgado approached carrying a small shopping bag. Darius immediately straightened. Hi, Miss Delgado. She smiled warmly. I haven't seen you at the community center. The teenager shrugged. Been busy. Busy avoiding me, perhaps. For the first time all evening, Darius genuinely smiled. Ruth handed him the shopping bag. Your favorite cookies. The teenager looked surprised. You remembered? Of course. She tapped his shoulder. Come visit soon. Then she continued walking. Nothing remarkable, nothing dramatic. Yet Caleb noticed something. The hopelessness that had clouded Darius moments earlier seemed lighter, as if one small interaction had reminded him that someone cared. That night, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about it. The coded letters, the network, the children, the seniors. The pieces fit together too well. Someone was protecting these kids, and doing it quietly. Weeks later, Caleb finally decided to confront Ruth. Not aggressively, not accusingly. He simply wanted answers. He found her sitting in the neighborhood park feeding birds. The winter chill was beginning to fade. Children played basketball nearby. Parents pushed strollers. Life continued as normal, at least on the surface. Caleb sat beside her. Can I ask you something? You just did. He smiled. Ruth smiled back. Then he became serious. I know about the letters. Her expression didn't change. The symbols. Still nothing. I've been tracking them for months. A pigeon landed near her feet. She tossed a crumb. I see. Caleb waited. No reaction, no panic, no denial. You aren't surprised? No. That answer caught him off guard. You knew someone would notice eventually. Not someone. She looked at him. You. The response sent a shiver down his spine. What does that mean? Ruth folded her hands. You notice things. Caleb remained silent. So do we. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Ruth asked a question. What do you think the network is? Caleb chose his words carefully. I think a group of elderly residents has been secretly sharing information about vulnerable children. Her eyes softened. That's close. Close? We don't track children. What do you track? Danger. The answer hung in the air. Ruth watched kids playing basketball. When you live long enough, patterns become visible. She pointed toward the court. You see children. Caleb nodded. I see futures. He frowned. What does that mean? It means I know which children have support and which do not. Ruth's voice remained calm. I know which homes are stable and which are struggling. She looked toward a nearby apartment building. I know which teenagers are being approached by people who don't have their best interests at heart. Caleb listened carefully. For years, she continued, people assumed older residents were irrelevant, invisible. A faint smile crossed her face. They underestimated us. Suddenly, Caleb understood. The network wasn't spying, it was observing, watching, connecting information, not to control people, to protect them. How many members? Ruth chuckled. You think I'd answer that? Dozens? She said nothing, which was answer enough. What exactly do the symbols mean? Different things. Such as? Requests for observation, welfare checks, warnings, updates. Caleb stared. You built an entire communication system. We improved one. What? The original started years ago. The revelation surprised him. How long? Long before you arrived. Ruth's gaze drifted toward the neighborhood. Long before most people noticed there was a problem. Caleb realized something. This isn't just about gangs. No. Or foster care. No. Then what is it about? For the first time, sadness entered Ruth's eyes. It's about children who become invisible. The answer stayed with him for days. Then the situation escalated. Rapidly. Unexpectedly. One morning, Caleb arrived at work to discover police vehicles parked near a small apartment building on his route. Yellow tape blocked the entrance. Residents gathered outside. Concerned voices filled the air. He soon learned what happened. Mrs. Eleanor Price, one of the elderly residents connected to the network, had experienced a break-in. Nothing valuable was stolen. Jewelry remained untouched. Electronics remained untouched. Cash remained untouched. The intruder had searched the home, thoroughly, deliberately, as though looking for something specific. That detail troubled Caleb. A lot. When he later spoke with Denise and Jordan, both shared his concern. Someone was hunting information, Jordan said. Or records, Denise added. Caleb nodded. Because many members of the network maintain notebooks, observations, community contacts, historical information. Nothing illegal, but potentially valuable. The break-in felt targeted, a warning, and it wasn't the last. Over the next month, several incidents occurred. Minor vandalism, anonymous threats, property damage. Nothing severe enough to dominate headlines, enough to create fear, enough to send a message. Someone had noticed the network. Someone didn't like it. The pressure intensified after a local community outreach program unexpectedly shut down due to funding issues. Several vulnerable teenagers suddenly lost access to mentors and activities. Within weeks, Caleb observed familiar faces lingering around dangerous influences, including Darius. The timing seemed too convenient. Then came the event that changed everything. Jordan arrived at the library one evening carrying a folder. His face was pale. You're not going to believe this. Denise looked up. What happened? Jordan spread documents across the table. Public records, court filings, placement histories, community reports. The information revealed something disturbing. A small number of foster homes connected to different cases shared unusual patterns: frequent child transfers, repeated complaints, missing documentation, children moving from placement to placement with little oversight. Not enough to prove corruption, enough to raise serious questions. Caleb felt sick. How many kids? Jordan swallowed. More than I expected. Denise rubbed her forehead. Do authorities know? Some reports were filed. Then what happened? Jordan's expression darkened. Nothing. Silence filled the room. The possibility was horrifying. Not because everyone involved was corrupt. Most foster families and caseworkers genuinely cared. But systems could fail. Oversight could fail. Children could disappear inside bureaucracy. And when that happened, who noticed? The answer was becoming increasingly clear. The seniors, the retirees, the people everyone overlooked. For years they had been watching, recording, connecting dots. Not because they had power, because they had patience. And now someone appeared determined to stop them. Late one evening, Caleb received an unexpected phone call. The number belonged to Walter Kim. His voice sounded tense. Can you come over? What happened? Just come. Caleb arrived 10 minutes later. Walter sat at his kitchen table. Several folders lay open before him. The retired mechanic looked older than usual, more tired, more worried. Someone followed me today. Caleb froze. What? Walter nodded. Black SUV. You're sure? I rebuilt engines for 40 years. I noticed details. Caleb sat down. Walter opened one of the folders. Inside were years of notes, community observations, names, dates, patterns. Nothing criminal, nothing invasive, yet incredibly detailed. This is what they're after. Caleb flipped through pages. The sheer scope amazed him. Hundreds of entries, years of information. Children receiving help, mentors assigned, concerns reported, problems addressed. A living record of community protection. Walter sighed. We never expected this. This? Attention. The older man stared at the folders. The best guardians are invisible. For the first time since discovering the network, Caleb felt genuine fear. Not for himself, for the people who had spent years helping others. Because invisible guardians had suddenly become visible. And somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was preparing their next move. For the first time since uncovering the network, Caleb understood the danger. Not the kind of danger that came from dark alleys or violent confrontations. This was quieter, more patient. Someone had realized that a group of retirees possessed years of observations connecting troubled teenagers, vulnerable children, suspicious foster placements, and local gang recruiters. The network had never gathered evidence for criminal investigations. That wasn't its purpose. Its purpose was protection. But protection required knowledge. And knowledge made certain people nervous. The following week brought more tension. Caleb noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked repeatedly near homes connected to the network. Jordan noticed strangers attending community meetings without participating. Denise discovered that several public records she'd previously accessed had suddenly become harder to locate. Individually, none of it proved anything. Together, it created a disturbing picture. Someone was paying attention. One evening, Caleb sat with Denise and Jordan inside the library's archive room. Boxes of neighborhood history surrounded them. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust. Jordan stared at a wall covered with notes. There has to be something we're missing. Denise nodded. Agreed. Caleb studied the connections. Children, schools, community centers, mentors, foster placements, recruiters. The network had spent years identifying patterns. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why now? Why were people suddenly interested in stopping them? Then Jordan froze. His eyes widened. Wait. What? Caleb asked. Jordan pointed toward a list of names. Several teenagers appeared repeatedly, including Darius Reed. And beside many of those names sat another category. Addresses, specific locations, the abandoned apartment complex, a neglected shopping plaza, several vacant houses, places where gang recruiters frequently gathered. Jordan turned toward them. The network wasn't only watching kids. Denise leaned forward. What do you mean? They were tracking recruitment locations. The room went silent. Jordan rapidly compared notes. The pattern became obvious. When recruiters changed locations, the coded network adapted. When new teenagers appeared around certain groups, warnings spread through the symbols. When children vanished from school programs, network members checked on them. The seniors had quietly mapped an entire ecosystem of risk. Not perfectly, not officially, but effectively. Caleb suddenly understood why someone wanted the records. The information exposed patterns, and patterns threatened people who benefited from operating in the shadows. 2 days later, the situation exploded. Darius disappeared, not permanently, but long enough to terrify everyone. He missed school, missed basketball practice, failed to answer calls. By evening, his mother was frantic. The network activated immediately. Caleb watched it happen. Phone calls, conversations, people moving through the neighborhood. Retirees who usually spent afternoons gardening suddenly became remarkably busy. Nobody panicked. Nobody made dramatic announcements. They simply started looking, observing, as they always had. Hours later, a breakthrough came. One elderly resident reported seeing Darius enter an abandoned warehouse district. Another recalled a vehicle description. A third recognized someone he'd been spending time with recently. The information flowed through the network faster than Caleb thought possible. Police were notified. Community leaders became involved. Shortly after midnight, Darius was located. Safe. Shaken, but safe. When Caleb visited him the next day, the teenager looked exhausted. What happened? Darius stared at the floor. I almost went with them. Caleb sat quietly. They promised everything. Money, protection, belonging, respect. All the things vulnerable teenagers often crave. Darius rubbed his eyes. I thought nobody would care. The statement hit Caleb harder than anything else, because that was the lie recruiters sold. Nobody cares. Nobody notices. Nobody's coming. Yet an entire neighborhood had spent years proving otherwise. You know how many people looked for you last night? Darius looked surprised. Caleb told him. Teachers, retirees, neighbors, friends, volunteers, people he'd barely spoken to. The teenager's eyes filled with tears. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Then he whispered, Why? Caleb smiled. Because you're one of ours. The words seemed simple, yet they changed something inside the boy. News of Darius's disappearance spread quickly. So did news of how many people had mobilized to find him. The story strengthened the community. But it also increased pressure on those threatening the network, because their efforts were failing, and desperate people often make mistakes. The biggest mistake arrived 3 weeks later. It came from a source nobody expected. Sonia Ramirez, the foster care caseworker. For months, Caleb had viewed her cautiously. She always seemed close to the issues surrounding vulnerable children, close enough to raise questions, yet never close enough to answer them. Then she requested a meeting. She chose a quiet diner several neighborhoods away. When Caleb arrived, she looked nervous, not guilty, afraid. That distinction mattered. You've been investigating, she said. Observing. Same difference. She slid a folder across the table. Caleb opened it. His stomach tightened. Inside were reports, complaints, transfer records, documentation, years of it. What is this? Proof. Proof of what? Sonia looked exhausted. System failures. Caleb listened carefully. The reality proved complicated. There wasn't a giant criminal conspiracy. There wasn't a single corrupt organization. The truth was worse. Neglect, bureaucracy, overloaded staff, missed warnings, ignored complaints, children becoming files instead of people. And within those failures, a small number of individuals had learned how to exploit vulnerable situations for money or influence. They count on nobody connecting the dots, Sonia said. Caleb thought about the network, the symbols, the retirees, the years of observations. Except somebody did. Sonia nodded. Your seniors. For the first time, Caleb realized something profound. The network's greatest strength wasn't secrecy, it was continuity. Caseworkers changed, officials retired, programs lost funding, but the retirees stayed, year after year, watching, remembering, connecting information, providing context, being present. Sonia revealed another critical detail. Several complaints had vanished over the years, not through corruption, through administrative failures. Paperwork lost, reports misfiled, follow-ups forgotten. Nothing dramatic, just enough mistakes to leave children vulnerable. Combined with the network's records, however, those missing pieces formed a complete picture. The truth was finally visible, and once visible, it couldn't easily be hidden again. The months that followed became a whirlwind. Journalists began asking questions. Community organizations became involved. Oversight reviews were launched. Several questionable foster placements received renewed scrutiny. Additional support programs appeared. Mentorship initiatives expanded. Resources increased. The process wasn't perfect. Real life never is. But momentum had finally shifted. Then came the most emotional evening Caleb would ever experience. The community center hosted a gathering. Nothing formal, just neighbors, families, teachers, volunteers, children. Hundreds of people filled the building. Many had no idea the network existed. Others suspected pieces of it. Few understood its full scope. Ruth Delgado stood before the crowd. For perhaps the first time in decades, the invisible guardians were being recognized. She approached the microphone. The room quieted. Caleb expected a speech. Instead, Ruth smiled. "We didn't save anyone." Confused murmurs spread. She continued. "We noticed people." The room fell silent. "We listened." A pause. "We showed up." Another pause. "And when necessary, we reminded children they mattered." Tears appeared in more than a few eyes, including Caleb's, because she was right. The network hadn't operated through heroics. It had operated through consistency, through presence, through refusing to look away. After the event, people gathered in small groups. Stories emerged. A retired nurse who quietly arranged meals, a veteran who mentored struggling boys, a widow who provided tutoring, a mechanic who fixed bicycles, a librarian who connected children with resources. Hundreds of small acts, thousands of hours, years of service nobody had celebrated, until now. Several months later, spring arrived. The neighborhood felt different. Not transformed, just stronger, more connected. Darius completed his school year successfully. Jordan received acceptance letters from multiple colleges. Denise expanded youth programs at the library. Additional oversight measures improved local services. Life moved forward. One afternoon, Caleb received surprising news: a promotion. His new position would move him to a different postal district. It was good news, the kind most people celebrated immediately. Yet Caleb felt unexpectedly sad. His route had become part of his life. The neighborhood had become family. On his final day delivering mail, residents greeted him everywhere. Handshakes, hugs, cards, well wishes. By afternoon, he reached Ruth Delgado's house. She waited on the porch, as always. "Big day," she said. "I suppose." "You'll do well." Caleb handed her the mail. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ruth smiled. "You know the funny thing?" "What?" "You thought you discovered us." Caleb laughed. "I did." "No," she shook her head. "We discovered you." Before he could ask what she meant, she tapped the stack of envelopes. "Look closely." Confused, Caleb examined the mail. Then he froze. Near the corner of one envelope sat a tiny handwritten symbol, a small triangle, one of the original markings he'd noticed months earlier. He looked up. Ruth was smiling. "Some traditions survive." "You're still using the network?" She chuckled. "Of course." "After everything?" "Especially after everything." Caleb shook his head. "You'll never stop." "No." The answer carried absolute certainty. Because some responsibilities never ended. Some missions never truly concluded. Caleb laughed, then noticed movement across the street. Walter Kim was teaching a boy how to change a tire. Further down the block, another retiree spoke with a teenager carrying textbooks. Near the corner store, a grandmother handed sandwiches to 3 children walking home. Ordinary moments, easy to miss, unless you paid attention. And Caleb had learned to pay attention. As he walked away, he glanced back one final time. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Cars passed, children played, people chatted on porches. Nothing extraordinary. Yet now he understood the truth. Beneath the surface existed an invisible web of people who refused to let children face the world alone. No headlines, no medals, no recognition, just quiet guardianship. The kind that changed lives, the kind that saved futures. And somewhere in the neighborhood, tiny symbols would continue appearing on envelopes. Messages traveling from porch to porch, window to window, guardian to guardian. Because while most people believed the mail simply delivered letters, Caleb knew better. Sometimes it delivered hope. And sometimes hope arrived disguised as a handwritten mark no larger than a thumbnail. A mark that meant someone was watching, someone cared, and no child had been forgotten.